¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están ustedes? Les doy la bienvenida a una nueva actividad del Festival Puerto de Ideas Valparaíso 2021 que se realiza gracias al apoyo de Colbún, Copeuch y el Ministerio de las Culturas, las Artes y el Patrimonio. Soy Consuelo Saavedra, periodista, y a continuación voy a conversar con el destacado geógrafo social británico y académico de la Universidad de Oxford, Dorling, que nos va a explicar por qué lo que él ha llamado el slowdown, el fin de la gran aceleración, es algo bueno para el planeta, para la economía y es algo bueno finalmente para nuestras vidas. Acompáñennos entonces a conocer más sobre esta mirada revolucionaria para muchos. Les recordamos que esta actividad de Puerto de Ideas está siendo transmitida en puertodeideas.cl y también en YouTube. Esperamos que la disfruten. Professor Dorling, so glad to have you here. Welcome to Puerto Ideas.
Thank you ever so much for having me.
Well, we're so eager to learn more about your research on the speed of change and how this slowdown will affect the way we live for better, or so you argue. So please, the floor, or we should say rather the screen, is all yours.
Thank you ever so much. And I'll try to talk for just 30 minutes. I'm going to show you 30 slides, so it shouldn't be too hard for me to get my timing right. And this first one is showing you part of the cover of this book, Slow Down, which I published in January 2020, first of all, before anybody knew that we were going to have a pandemic. And I was arguing that by then, there was already enough evidence that the economy, our population, many things in the world were slowing down. And this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm also going to talk to you about the benefits of becoming more equal, because if societies don't become more equitable, then slowing down is very, very tricky for people. So I'm going to try to combine the two of these, and I'll show you some graphs in a minute about inequality first of all, and then I'll talk about slowing down more widely. The title of the book is Slow Down, but it has a very long subtitle, The End of the Great Acceleration and Why It's Good for Our Planet and Economy and Our Lives. The Great Acceleration was a period when capitalism began, and then increased and spread out of Europe, when we began to consume more and more goods and more resources and more fuel, and we began to pollute the planet more and more. And when I say we, I'm talking about Europeans and especially British people. And we also spread out to other parts of the world, invaded them, changed them, destroyed their social systems and social structures, often, sometimes without meaning to, sometimes deliberately, and caused great accelerations almost everywhere else in the world. So the Great Acceleration is this growth, if you like, most simply, of human population, which was growing very slowly, to suddenly a doubling and a doubling and a doubling again. So we now have almost 8 billion people on the planet. We've had a slowdown since the late 1960s. In the very beginning of that slowdown, it was difficult to see. Now I would say it's more obvious. The sandcastle, in case you're wondering why there's a picture of a sandcastle on the slide, it's a suggestion of the kind of thing in the future we could do if we slow down even more. More time to build sandcastles, more time to play, less time to have to work relentlessly. Inequality. And this relates to the slowdown because one reason we may not get a future in which we can actually all live slower, happier lives is if inequality carries on to be very high in particular places. When inequality is high, some of us have to work a great deal of time for a small number of people who have great resources who can pay us to look after them. Now, these graphs are from a book called Fintopia. They're about the changing share of the top 1%. And the reason for showing you them is just to point out that Inequality has been rising in the UK, and if you look at the smaller graph, you can see the USA there, but it has been rising everywhere in recent years. In fact, in the majority of OECD countries, it's actually fallen a little since 2008 rather than having risen. Sweden and Finland are shown as two examples of falls in inequality recently. That's the take of the top 1% falling. Now, the UK and Chile are unusual in OECD countries. We are both remarkably economically unequal, as I'll show you in a minute. We're also similar in other ways. We're the two OECD countries which spend the highest proportion of monies on private education. For instance, we have the largest private education sector in the OECD. And these things go together. As your economic inequalities rise, as income inequalities rise, your society divides in other ways. People don't like mixing with each other when they earn very different amounts from each other, and they find ways to separate from each other. Here's the overall OECD ranking of inequality by income. I can try and speak very quickly for all the countries which are more equal, which you may not be able to see depending on how big your screen is. All the countries which are more equal to the United Kingdom are the Slovak Republic, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Iceland, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, Finland, Austria, Sweden, Poland, the Netherlands, Germany, Hungary, Ireland, Switzerland, Canada, France, Estonia, Greece, Portugal, Russia, Luxembourg, Australia, Italy, Spain, Japan, Latvia, Korea, Israel, Romania, Lithuania, and finally you get to United Kingdom, the most unequal large country in Europe. Then the United States is a fraction more unequal. This is the OECD's Gini coefficient. Then Turkey, Bulgaria, Mexico, there's Chile, and then Costa Rica. Now, I won't say much more about this. We can talk about it later, but it really, really does drag us apart. It fractures societies. It may not look dramatic on that graph. You may think, oh, it's only a little bit higher than some of those other countries, but you go to those countries, you measure how things work, particularly Finland, which I've looked at in detail. And well, for instance, Finland ranks first, second, or third in over 100 indicators of social achievements in the world. Okay, and the United Kingdom doesn't, essentially. The education is incredible. The housing is incredible. The number of homeless people on the streets is practically zero. Greatest work-life balance in the world, lowest infant mortality rate ever recorded in the history of the human species. I can go on and on about the benefits of living in a more equal, affluent country. Stepping forward again, and we'll promise you I'll get on to slow down very soon, but I just wanted to give this context. There are complicated relationships with inequality. This is one where, this is one of the most complicated graphs in the book I did called The Equality Effect, where these little bars are bunched. The first bunch has had number 6 under them, and they're bunched by how unequal the countries are. 6 means that the best of 10th are getting 6 times more than the worst of 10th. That's the best you get in the world. And those countries which are most equal, the 6, have between 1 and 2 babies per woman, some of the lowest rates. As inequality increases, the rate of fertility tends to be higher. You have more children in countries where you don't expect the state to look after you in old age. And then the other aspect of that graph there is that the darkness of the bar is the overall level of affluence. So the darker bars are poorer countries, the lighter bars are richer countries. And you can see that within each grouping of country by inequality, it goes up. The poorer, the more children people have, but the more equal, the fewer children people have. It's complicated. I honestly don't expect you to get this in a talk this fast, but I want to get over the idea that it isn't just about having more money that makes the country do well. It's about how you share those monies out. And this all relates to slowdown. And it really, really matters for children and babies. Because we're entering a new period, and I'm going to talk a lot about the changing number of babies, where if we were to become more equal faster than we currently are, then we could actually expect overall global population to be even lower than we currently expect it to be. And that kind of thing might be very good for the planet and very good for us. Alternatively, if we have economic crashes in the future, things fall apart, inequalities rise, certain groups win over other groups, many people are made destitute, we should see a much larger population of humans in future, and that may be more tricky to deal with. let me get on to the slowdown book now. In a minute. I forgot to add one more slide. You think, so what happens when you do have very few children, if you do have very few children? Well, here's Finland, and this is the number of children on the right from 1900 until 2020, going down to about 1.3 per woman at the moment, very low. And the graph on the left is the numbers of people coming into Finland. So you end up replacing the babies you don't have with people coming from elsewhere where there are more babies. And this is interesting and often highly contentious. But in the case of Finland, it's part of the EU, unlike the UK. So there's a free movement of labour. People can move from other parts of Europe to Finland. You might think, why would they want to go somewhere so cold? And this becomes interesting over, I would argue, the other way around. Why, given that Finland has some of the best schools on the planet, some of the best jobs, some of the best social security, some of the best housing, why don't more people move from the rest of Europe, given they're allowed to somewhere like Finland? But we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Finally, we're on to population and slowdown. This is your standard population graph, the one that's normally presented at the moment, where we're in the middle of COP26 as we're recording this. And I think we're still being COP26 by the time you see this. And the standard scary population graph of the world starts many thousands of years ago with hardly anybody around, 10,000, 8,000, 6,000 before the current era, and then has this explosion in population up to almost 8 billion people now. And it looks like a kind of runaway train. If you look at the graph in the middle, it's actually showing a train kind of going out of control and zooming up. That's the standard way in which population is shown, and that frightens people and tends to make them think there are far too many human beings on the planet. This is how I show it in the slowdown book. And to make it easier to see, that little red dot, which you're going to find very hard not to look at, we're rather like cats. As soon as you put a moving dot, you will spot it. That little red dot is moving along, showing you what's happening to world population at various dates. So how this graph differs from the one I showed you before is that here, you're looking at the total number of people on the vertical axis, but on the horizontal axis, you're not looking at time anymore. You're looking at the change in the number of people each year. And in the 1940s, 50s, and 1960s, that change was really, really big. An extra 40, an extra 60 million people a year, an extra 80 million people a year. But since the 1980s, that change has kind of stayed the same at around about an extra 80 million people every year. That's births minus deaths. And from 2020 onwards, it's set to reduce as we get more deaths than births, because there's a lot of us around at the moment. We're all the people who were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And once this bulge works its way through, the increase becomes less, and then the population stabilizes. At the moment, somewhere around about 11 billion people, but it could easily be 10, it could be 12, it could be very different. And that's only less than 100 years away, right? We're not sure yet. And I always think it's worth thinking when people tell you they're sure about all kinds of things, tell them, well, how many people are there going to be in less than 100 years' time by 2100 on the planet? And the fact they can't tell you that maybe should give you an idea about how much is in our hands. Let's go forward. And I'm going to look at this another way now. So here's global population, but instead of normal scales, there's a log scale on both axes. And again, most people watching this will hate this. People do not like graphs. But if you don't like graphs, the slowdown book is not for you. But if you don't look at things, numerical things in this way, you really can't get an idea of what's going on. Here's 2,100 years of human history in one graph. By altering the axis, you can see that, and you'll see there's a couple of kinks in the graph. In general, the population's going up, but it doesn't always go up, or it goes up slightly less fast globally than it did before. And the three kinks, let's go through them as the red dot starts off. The first is shortly after 1492. That's people coming across the Atlantic with their germs to the Americas and slowing the speed of population growth. Secondly, after 1820, that's the depopulation of Africa, mainly in the slave trade and the colonization of the British. And then after 2020, and this is a nice one, this is people, and in particular women in very large numbers, like billions, choosing and able to have fewer children because they can. Whereas the first two are generally due to death, destruction, conquest, and war. Let's go forward again and have a look at some different countries. China is one of the most interesting ones at the moment. And if you have a look at the graph for China, you'll see it's distinct. It has a particular shape. Every country in the world, you could draw a graph like this, and I have done, and they have different shapes. And the graphs are about the history. And then from 2020 onwards, it's the United Nations projections. China peaks in 2030, 9 years from now. And then population rapidly reduces back down to 1 billion in 79 years from now, back to what it was in 1980. And if you look at the little kinks earlier on in the 19th century in China, you can see things like the effects of the Opium Wars and so on. So although China wasn't part of the British Empire, the British and some other European states certainly interfered in China in a way which then went on to have effects later. Let's go forward from China to the whole of Africa. Because people often say, well, the population is slowing down in certain places, but it's increasing in the whole of Africa. So the population of the world is out of control. Well, it's set to slow down in Africa as well. And it may slow down even faster than these projections suggest, because fertility at the moment is slowing down across Africa far faster than the projections suggest they would. I'm going to go forward to another large area of population in the world, which is the whole of India. And again, you can see that acceleration in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It looks out of control, slows down, been slowing since the year 2000. So we've had 20 years of this already in India. Is set to peak, and this is India plus Pakistan plus Bangladesh, is set to peak in 2064 and then fall. And these are simply UN projections based on fertility and mortality rates and what we know. This isn't me making up these numbers. These are widely accepted numbers. And in recent years, they've been heading downwards. They've been revised, well, question about when it's reliable, but in detail from 1820. And you can look at that GDP graph. And it's in trillions. Oh no, it's per capita, this one. So it's in thousands of dollars. And it appears to be sloping to the right. So you may be looking at that and thinking, well, it's going up and up and up and up. But I'd argue that on this graph, since 2006, that black dot out in 2006, you could suggest that in fact, it's sloping the other way. 2008 was a big crash, accelerates again in 2010, slows down again a bit, accelerates in 2015, slows down in 2018. 2019 was a slowdown. 2020 was a pandemic. So we know it's going to go across the axis. Now, the problem with things like GDP is we tend to look at each little perturbation and we say, oh, that's the financial crash of 2008. That's the oil shock of the 1970s. That's the recession of the 1980s. But you've got to step back from that. I'm going to go to a log graph one more time for you now. So GDP on a log graph. And if you look at it on a log graph, exactly the same data, it actually looks as if the peak was 1950 or 1964. And it's definitely sloping to the left, I would argue. This is the point where I start waving my hands around in the air quite a lot when you're trying to convince people that that graph is sloping that way. But you can measure average GDP growth per decade in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And you'll find that each decade, global GDP growth has been less than the decade before. And each time we've said, oh, it's due to particular factors. And of course, you know, superficially, the pandemic will have mattered, but it was slowing down before the pandemic came. And if it hadn't been a pandemic, it would have been something else. You've got to step back. And it's when you step back that you begin to see actually something bigger and longer is going on than the superficial things that historically we find ever so interesting and we think were terribly, terribly important at the time. But GDP is something that just couldn't carry on accelerating at the rate it was. It's still growing, it's still going up, but it just can't double at the rate it was doubling because you'd burn up all your resources if it were to do that. But then the problem comes, and this is why I started with inequality. if it doesn't increase in the future hugely, then you have to tell people, well, the only way your children are going to have a better life is if you share things out more. Because the standard promise of people who like inequality is, don't worry, economic growth will mean that your children or your grandchildren will be okay. Well, look at the trend from 1950. That's not the way in which it's been moving. I'm going to quickly show you China. So even China was slowing down, first 2008, but you can see it again after 2010, 2019. And of course, China slowed down as worldwide demand for goods slowed during the pandemic and in the recession. And that's not a bad thing. China officially is the biggest emitter in the world of carbon pollution, but it's only the biggest emitter because China produces the goods that we buy. In effect, it's emitting our pollution. Let's zoom through a few more of these, because it's not just GDP and it's not just population. We can also measure things like emissions. This is carbon emissions worldwide. And here's an example of something which isn't slowing down. So not everything is slowing down. It's also something which is very, very hard to measure. Carbon emissions, it's tricky to be sure how much we are emitting, but in general, the graph leans towards the right. By 2018, we're emitting something like 37 billion tons of CO2 a year. And sadly, every time you get one of these climate summit agreements, like the Rio Earth Summit and the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, you tend to get an acceleration afterwards as people think they've done something about it. But you know, I'm kind of hopeful. I think eventually we will realize we do have to reduce, and that this will not carry on accelerating forever. Or if it does, we won't be around to measure it, so we won't be drawing these graphs. Let's zoom forward from emissions to something that's actually even harder than emissions to measure. Oh, sorry, here's a traditional measure of emissions, by the way. So if you're wondering, why am I drawing these really, really weird graphs? It's because they highlight all the detail in something like that. That's the graph you normally see of emissions, okay, going up and up. But it doesn't show you those little twists and turns. And those little twists and turns are really important. You want to know, are we decelerating or accelerating? At the end there, it's going up a little bit faster, so it's accelerating. But the graph I just showed you gives you all the detail. Now, sorry, now the one I expected to see, which is temperature. Much harder to measure than emissions, because you have to measure it in many, many different parts of the world, where emissions, as long as you measure it somewhere in the middle of the Pacific that's fairly undisturbed by other things, you get a pretty good measure of it. But temperature, you could be a carbon skeptic until about 2008, I would say. But after then, you just see the temperature going up and up and up and up. So emissions accelerating, temperature accelerating. Most other things, though, are decelerating. Let's go forward again. Stock market. The reason for showing you this graph is just to say that these graphs are not ways of predicting the future, okay? They look very pretty, but they don't tell you. You look at this one and you go, look, it's zooming off after 1996. This is the NASDAQ. You go, oh, look, it's just going to be enormous. I can make my fortune. If I buy stocks in 1996, it'll be absolutely fine. But let's go forward and see what happened after 1996. And after 1996, it went up again, but then you get this amazing double loop, like a roller coaster. And that's a dot-com crash. It's what a crash looks like, a double crash on a graph like this. And then you can look at it, you see it going up 2008, 2009, 2010, it's going up again. You want to invest, dips slightly 2015, but then it goes up and up and up again. But then you're going to get really scared because 2018, 2019 is slowing down. So you think if you invest in 2019 in the NASDAQ, you're going to do really badly. In fact, you'd have done brilliantly, because the world started to watch Netflix and go on Facebook and buy Apple because there's a pandemic, right? So this graph doesn't predict the future. That's why I wanted to show you this, but it does produce you at least a slightly more interesting picture of the past than your normal graph of stocks and shares. You know, they can't do a double loop like a roller coaster in them. Different things, student debt. And this is about the granularity of change or what matters. This is student debt in the United States. And every year, the amount of money that students in the United States borrow so that they can go to university goes up and up and up. And it goes up particularly in October, because that's when they go in the autumn to university. But you'll see that after 2009, the graph curves. still going up, but not as fast. There was less money to lend students then. You couldn't have increasing student fees rising and rising and rising. Even in a state like the United States that would never envisage doing what most of Europe does, which is you go to university for free. People don't tend to know that in the US or in the UK. You know, you don't pay a penny. But anyway, it's still sloping a different way. And by looking at it in this way, you can say, when did it happen? When was the kink in the curve in this? At some point, student debt cannot just rise exponentially forever. Something we invented, something that has to go away again. Wikipedia. This is my single example of the size of the internet, because people say, oh, the internet's just expanding exponentially. Well, it isn't. There's only so many so many pictures of yourself you can take and videos you can put up. But Wikipedia, it slowed down in 2007. Everything has at some point to slow down, essentially because there are less and less interesting things to describe on Wikipedia. Here's something though, which has zoomed up. There's the third thing. It's the number of graduates in the world. And you'll see that it's rising and rising and rising. By this particular UN measure, it gets up to just over a third of all people of these ages. But it's just an easy one to tell you it's going to have to slow down because, well, it can't go up to over 100% of all people, so it will slow down. But we're currently in a worldwide boom of universities. Right, we have an explosion of universities, just as we had an explosion of secondary schools 50 or 60 or 70 years ago in the world. Right, but it will slow down. But that's the third thing that is still accelerating that I found. Most things slowing down. Species extinction, I've only got 5 minutes left, so I promise to end on time. But species extinction, you'll be pleased to know, is slowing down. The reason you'll be pleased and slowed down since the 80s, these are large species, not insects. But still, by the year 2013, 70% of large species have become extinct in the world. They're mostly rare species, mostly on islands. If it hadn't slowed down, it would be at 100%. And if it was 100%, that would include us, and we'd all be extinct. Okay, yeah. So it's kind of superficially good news, but really you do want that to absolutely stop. Going forward again, here's my last one of something accelerating, or that was accelerating. It's the millions of people flying per year in the world. And you can see that it temporarily goes negative in a dot-com crash in 2001, slows down again in 2008, but then absolutely soars up to 210. Slows down a little bit then, but then goes up and up and up again. And of course, with the pandemic, this will have crossed over the line. You'll actually see the biggest collapse in flights ever. The question is, are we going to go back to 2017, 2018 levels in future? Just a few more of these slides left. In fact, just 4 more after this. This is the number of babies in the world. Easily obtainable data, but look at it this way and you begin to see these loops. These loops are baby booms. They're global baby booms. After the Second World War, there's a baby boom in Europe. Europe's smaller, doesn't really matter. South America's small, doesn't really matter. There's also a baby boom in India. With the partition of India, it creates disruption. Whenever there's disruption like a war or partition, you get more babies. Even more disruption in China. There's a revolution, a communist revolution in China. Babies go up to 6 per woman. Those global baby booms after the Second World War have an echo that comes back with a slump in the 50s in babies, a slump in the 70s in babies, but we're entering something new now, where it's looping around for the year 2000. If you're following the dot, as people tend to do, you'll see it's no longer zooming up and up and up, out of control. Part of what we've seen in recent years has been that. Life expectancy, just giving you a sort of whistle stop tour of the many things you can look at. Fastest rises were in 1966, because infant mortality was falling fastest then. Slows down in 1992, accelerates again as we begin to reduce deaths from AIDS, slowing down again. The World Bank thinks it's going to do that, going to go up very high. I think that's unlikely. I think if you just look at the long-term trends, you can see which projections being made in the future are less reliable than others. I'm almost at the end of my slides. This is my last graph I'm going to show you. It's the final graph in the slowdown book. in a way, it's the most complicated. It's about Tokyo and about whether Tokyo is growing more, the city of Tokyo in Japan, whether it's growing more in the suburbs or in the center. And that sometimes the suburbs are growing, at other times the center is growing. But it spirals around, and eventually, after the 1960s, 70s, 80s, it ends up in the middle because Tokyo stops growing. It becomes stable, 30 million people, no longer oscillating between growing high on the outside and growing high on the inside. Tokyo is an example of stability, of reaching a stability after a slowdown. By the way, the reason I include that graph is that this way of graphing was invented in the 1970s in Japan. So I thought I'd end with a picture from Japan of it happening. And you may have seen these graphs before if you're interested in maths or physics. They're called phase portraits. They're used to show how a pendulum slows down. So there's a pendulum moving from left to right, and the phase portrait is showing the speed of the pendulum and also its position. And as it slows down, that little dot eventually goes into the middle. That's what a slowdown, that's what a deceleration is. My final slide, I didn't begin writing the book Slowdown with Slowdown as its title. I began writing a book looking for what was accelerating and what was speeding up and what was slowing down in the world, expecting to find roughly 50-50. But what I found is that far more things were slowing down than were speeding up. And the implication of that is that something is changing. It's changing too slowly for us to notice it because it changes decade by decade by decade. So you have to look back and pull back and look out. But it's generally good news. It would be terrible if we still had the speeds of economic growth that we had in the 40s, 50s, and 1960s. It would be terrible if we had the human population growth we had in the 60s, which was about 2% a year. Within 300 years, we'd be covering the planet in a seething mass of bodies if we did that. So the slowdown is good news. It's hard to work out exactly why it's happened. It's hard to be sure it will continue to happen. And we need it to happen in those areas like emissions and pollution where it hasn't yet happened, but it's a good thing. And I really wanted to talk about it because we rarely have good stories. And this was a good news story as far as I was concerned. And it means that I can spend more time making sandcastles and beaches and not worry so much about the world. Thank you ever so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dorling. Quite uncommon, I would say, an optimistic view nowadays about the future, or even more, an optimistic view about something that many experts consider bad, right? So let me start by asking you to elaborate a little bit more about the concept of growth and how you see it. Because as you were explaining, this trend of slower economic growth that we are seeing is here to stay, despite all the explanations that we try to find. So what should governments do about it? You mentioned something about inequality, for instance, but should they just stop trying to implement policies aimed at making the economy growth and pick up again at the rate that we see in previous decades?
I think you get to a point where you have to decide that what's happening is no longer temporary. After 2 decades of very low growth in productivity worldwide, seeing it as something that's unusual when it becomes usual is silly. When this first happened in Japan, we called it the lost decade of economic growth in Japan. And then when it happened for a second decade, we called it 2 lost decades. What we didn't do is look at Japan and say, what else is happening in Japan? What's happening to life expectancy? What's happening to population numbers? Whereas in fact, Japan still has the highest life expectancy in the world. So the 2 lost decades of growth were not necessarily that terrible for Japan. But it's a generational change in thinking. I think one reason we haven't adapted to the slowdown is that people tend to believe what they believe when they're young, and it's very hard to shake them out of that. So the Prime Minister of this country, back in 2009-10, Gordon Brown, had a target of a minimum of 2% economic growth a year for Britain. Now, this would result in an enormous country in terms of economy in just 20, 30, 40 years if you applied 2%. And there's a question about how many cars can a family park outside its house? How big can the house be? And Gordon Brown, who was an economist, never stepped back and looked at his 2% growth a year and actually asked, what was it he was trying to achieve? What were we going to do with all those riches in future? So I think we do need a change. The problem comes in countries which are very unequal, because in unequal countries, you've got lots of people who desperately need more because they don't have enough. And you also have people who've got a lot who desperately don't want to give any of it up because they're so frightened of having less. Whereas when you look at the more equal countries of the world, and Japan's one of those, but again, Northern Europe is similar, it's much easier to see how you can slow down economic growth in a more equitable country because you have far fewer people who are just living hand to mouth. But also the people who've got most are not so desperate for more growth so that they can have more and more. They tend to be calmer, they fit into their society better.
And can we talk a bit more about the countries that are in the transition? So I'm thinking about low and middle income countries. How could they provide for the goods and services that people need if growth is not the goal anymore? Is it just taxing the wealthiest 1% or, I don't know, 10%?
No, it's more than that. I mean, the most interesting country to look at in the world in terms of this is China. China is a country that's gone from mass poverty. The vast majority of people were poor in the 1970s and 80s in China, to becoming an incredibly affluent country, where you now go to China and you see people have much larger cars than they have in Europe, and those cars are sitting in traffic jams. And I think this is a kind of message for the world. China used to have many, many people cycling. It now has people sitting in traffic jams in large cars. The question is, do you want to go through, or try to go through if you could, that particular transition? Or do you want to try to work out how could you go to a situation where your streets are not packed with more and more vehicles because of the kind of economic growth that you've had? So it's not just a case of taxing the rich more, it's also trying to work out what you're trying to head towards. Another example would be swimming pools. Do you want to move to a situation such as the one in California, where thousands of people have their own individual swimming pools in their house? Is that a good thing to want? And you may think, oh, that looks lovely. I wish I could afford a swimming pool. But they're expensive. They're hard to look after. They're also dangerous for your children. And it's these kind of things that are tricky, because we've gone from wanting to have double glazing so we're not cold and to have a spare chair for a guest to come to our house. We've gone from moving out of poverty into relative comfort. And then we thought, oh, if we do that again and again, we'll gain the same kind of happiness. And you actually end up with things that don't make you happier, living further apart from other people in large mansions that, eventually you can't necessarily look after or heat, where your neighbors are too far away to get to know them.
With a pool in the basement, as you make fun of here in London, for instance.
Yes, that was, I didn't mean to do that. That was, I was with a famous journalist in London, and we were looking at a 3-bed house in Mayfair, just 3 bedrooms, and it wasn't even detached. And we were taken in by the estate agent and taken down, and they covered the taps in gold and so on. It was going for millions. It could have been 20 million pounds they were trying to sell this house. And we went down to the second basement, and it was entirely a swimming pool. And I just turned to the reporter after they started filming and just said, "This is a death trap." And the estate agent then just shouted, "Get out." But that's people's, this is, I think the sad thing, it's not necessarily sad. If the super rich are really, really happy, if they were actually ecstatic, if their lives were wonderful, and if the better off you got, the happier you became.
But maybe they are. Who knows?
Well, we can measure it. This is the great thing about measuring. So the greatest level of antidepressant use in the world is Beverly Hills. You know, so if they are happy, they're taking a lot of antidepressants in these affluent areas, whereas in more equal countries, mental health is much lower. We can measure the degree of anxiety and depression, and taking antidepressant pills is much lower.
Well, that's something to learn about in Chile too. We have very high consumption of antidepressant, and mental health is really a big issue nowadays. So if the promise of each generation, it's going, I mean, that every next generation is going to be better off than the previous one, if that promise is broken, what should be the new promise? And how do we make the adjustment, you know, for the people who get caught in the middle of the transition, of the shift?
Yes. I think the new promise should be that you're still going to have a lot of change. It's just that the change will not be material. So, for instance, outside my house, there are 3 very large plastic waste bins, one for recyclables, one for other goods, one for organic, but they're enormous. And they're 6 times the volume of the house I grew up in as a child, because we threw away 6 times less when I was a child. And that's the average for the UK. That's the average for the UK, is people buy so much more, they throw so much more away. The future of our children cannot be 36 giant bins outside your house because you buy and throw away so more. But it has to be faster change in other ways. And I end the Slowdown book talking about Japan, because Japan currently has very quick social change in terms of attitudes, how people are treated, how the royal family and the aristocracy is thought of. And this connects. The man who invented the graph in the 1970s, his daughter actually married into the royal family. She was the first commoner to be allowed to do that. And this may sound like a small thing, but there are other ways in which young people want to be able to do things differently. Sexuality is a good example. You know, if I had wanted to be gay as a teenager, it would have been so hard in the 1980s, so difficult. The government actually outlawed the promotion talking about being gay. That's now much, much easier. But in the future, it should be so easy we don't even notice. It's not something that is remarked upon. And there'll be other changes, social and cultural changes, of things we take absolutely for granted at the moment, of this is how you do something, that our children will look back and say, can you believe that they did that? Whereas, you know, we just assume this is the correct way of behaving. Take out elderly people living on their own in retirement, you know, in one house after another, the absolute loneliness that occurs to some people in old age, and the inefficiency of doing that, the sitting there in the house that you've managed to buy on your own, waiting for the relatives to visit. That kind of thing may be seen as, this was ridiculous. How come society had not organized itself so that if you wanted to live in a different way in your old age after you've had children, you could do so. So all kinds of changes happen. They always have happened, and they will happen. The last thing I'll say, we tend to imagine the future as just being like now, because it's hard to imagine. But the best way to see how different the future will be is to go back 100 years to 1921 and just think, how different was 1921? And then you go forward 100 years and you go, well, it's going to be as different again in the future. Even with the slowdown, the overall change will be as different.
Have you thought a little bit about why the UK and Chile are such outliers when we were talking, for instance, about fertility rate and how, I mean, the women going into the workforce and you know, and taking control of their bodies and having fewer children. And that tends to happen in prosperous countries, which are usually not that unequal. So what do you think happens with Chile and the UK, where fertility rates, I mean, in Chile, fertility rate is very, very low, has been plummeting, and we're such an unequal country at the same time?
Yes, no, it is interesting on that. The whole of South America has low fertility rates, and there are particular reasons in particular countries. In Brazil, it really was the showing of soap operas with very small families that actually has an influence on the population. when it comes to inequality, it's tricky to know why. One of the reasons I often say for the United Kingdom is because it used to have an empire, and so it's people trying to regain the empire. But another reason, which I say less, but has to matter, is the influence of the United States. And the influence of the United States on the UK is far bigger than on any other country in Europe. Gordon Brown, Prime Minister I liked, one of our most left-wing Prime Ministers in recent years. Gordon Brown used to travel every summer to Cape Cod, to the US, to see how things were done there. He didn't travel to the rest of Europe, where the statistics are so much better, to see how it's done there.
But he traveled to Cape Cod?
Yeah, he traveled to Cape Cod.
But it's a very posh place to visit, I have to say.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know what you learned there, but...
Well, he talked to Americans. So we have American economists coming over saying, this is what you should do with your schools, this is what you should do with your prisons. The rest of Europe tends to ignore Americans more. Chile certainly was influenced by the USA in particular ways in its past. And that area of domination of the USA. But interestingly, Japan very subtly managed to ignore it. And Japan's a lovely example of this and of the idiosyncrasies of things. Japan was one of the most unequal countries in the world in the 1930s, like Germany was in the 1930s. The gap between rich and poor in Germany and Japan was very, very high, bigger than neighboring countries. And when the gap between rich and poor is really high, things tend to break down. You get riots, it doesn't work. After the Second World War, when America had invaded Japan, the Americans were very worried there was going to be a revolution in Japan, a communist revolution in Japan, because they'd lost the war. So what America did was redistribute the land and the wealth as equitably as they could, destroying most of the aristocracy apart from the royal family, and creating a quality of outcome and opportunity that you'd never seen anywhere in the world before in Japan, and created the world's most equal large country. And it's a natural experiment in what happens if you do that. And the outcome was quite incredible. Japan has a 90% middle class or a 90% working class because it's one class. You can't have inequalities that low and then have people see themselves being that different. So it's not utopia, but it shows in a way that the influence of America there was less than it's been on South America and less than it's been, say, on the UK.
Why do you see capitalism as a transition? Because I was thinking that, I don't know, ambition and the desire to have more or the desire to innovate, isn't that all part of the human nature?
I think it's only in the last couple of 100 years that we decided it is part of human nature. And I've even seen people claim that the idea of owning land and property is an innate thing which comes with our genome. And this is slightly ridiculous because, of course, for the vast majority of human evolution, we were traipsing around in small groups hunter-gathering. So the idea that there's something in our genetics that makes us want to hold on and own something, when that isn't actually how we evolved. And of course, we have almost identical genes to those hunters and gatherers. But capitalism developed its apologists. So as some people became wealthier, they employed people to tell a particular story. That Thomas Malthus was the world's first employed economist. And he was employed, I think it was, I think it's the East India Company, who were colonizing India and so on. He was employed to tell a particular story, or because he had a particular view that said that the people who were becoming rich were good. And all they were doing by trying to take over the rest of the world was something that anybody would want to do, because this was an innate human nature. Now, the brilliant thing in the recent decades is that we have more studies than we've ever had in the history of the world before. So everything gets studied, and human beings are studied. And we discover that when we study people, roughly 4 out of 5 are not greedy. They're pro-social. They want to share. Roughly 1 out of 5 is a bit more selfish and a bit more greedy and wants to keep them something to themselves.
Sorry, can you say the numbers again?
Roughly 4 out of 5, 80% of people are fairly pro-social.
Okay.
They want to share. They're not driven by greed. They want
and 20 are greedy.
20% are greedy. It's roughly the same around the world, but different countries control their greedies or don't control their greedy. So in somewhere like Finland, the greedy are controlled. They're taxed more, but also they're controlled socially by the culture of the place, which says, don't think of yourself as much better than other people. Don't try. And this annoys some greedy people, and they often leave and come and live in London, so many
in that Mayfair house you mentioned.
Yes, they can do that. So often you'll find Scandinavians in somewhere like the UK, and they've come because they dislike the kind of, they call it the conformity. They say, oh, it's terrible, it's suffocating, the conformity. Whereas in somewhere like the UK now, and the key thing is it's now. In the 1970s, we were the second most equal country in Europe to Sweden. The UK was almost Scandinavian. But in the UK now, greed is encouraged. We've just had a budget which has reduced taxes for the very rich and has not even restored the £20 a week that the poor were getting due to the pandemic. And it's, the greedy are called wealth creators or job creators, or, it's in a country that's become very unequal. Whereas in more equal countries, that isn't the word or language which is used.
Yeah. And they create this wealth, then we borrow. And I want to talk a little bit about debt. And you're a very critic, of course, of debt for students in education that we can get, maybe for housing also that we can get. You mentioned in the book this idea of, well, in the good old times, people will save their money, and once they had all the money, they will get their vehicle, Ford. You mentioned the old Ford. Yes. But what would be the problem with borrowing money to get a car? I will, to lease the car, I will drive it now, and I pay for it, and then I sell it. So what is the problem with this wealth and debt?
Okay, in terms of the car, if what you're doing is if you're always buying cars in terms of debt, then you're paying far more for the car than you otherwise would have to pay.
But they don't drive it right away.
You can have it straight away. It's instant gratification. Yes,
exactly.
So when the 2008 crash occurred, it was really bad news for General Motors in the United States, because it turned out that these, what we thought were car companies, were actually debt companies. And they were making more money through the debt and the interest they were charging than through the actual money they were making a car. And this is a problem. And you get seduced into the idea that you always need a new car. So after 2 or 3 years, you should be getting another car. But don't worry, you can afford it because we'll lend you the money. You don't actually have to have it. And then you have this status symbol. And why do you need a shiny new car which looks as if it's worth $40,000 or $50,000? Well, that's to show that and it's often gendered, that you're the big man, and the car shows something about you as a man. Now, in a society where people are much more averse to debt, and to some people becoming very rich by giving out debt, you have far fewer cars. And again, I'll give you the example of Japan. The number of cars in Japan has been falling for over 20 years every year, because they construct better and better public transport systems. So you don't need a car. And we find that hard to imagine that happening. But in some ways, fewer young people are actually getting driving licenses because they can't even afford to buy a house. How are they ever going to get a car? And of course, as the incomes of the majority of young people don't rise in an unequal country, they won't have enough money for these people trying to make money out of them by lending them money. So you end up squeezing the middle and trying to get debt from them. And eventually it doesn't work. You can't carry on making more and more out of the rest of the population so that you can have multiple times their income and their wealth. It eventually always and everywhere fails. But the problem is that on the way up, on the spiral up of inequality, the rich tend to control the media, the newspapers and so on, and say what a good job they're doing, and politicians often, and whole political parties. And that just makes the crisis even larger when you eventually get to a crisis.
And what do we do with, well, it's not that I wanted to, defend car owning or anything. It's just an example that was in the book. That's why I mentioned it, because I mean, we all, shifting to other ways of transport, and of course, public transport. But what happened with government debt, with countries' debt? I was looking at the numbers in Finland, actually, and they have, 82% of GDP in debt. Or Japan also very high debt.
Yes, no, it's high. In Japan, it's internal, in that it's the savings of the old people that old people invest in the government debt, which makes Japan in a way more robust.
I see, for pensions.
The country that really gets away with it at the moment is the USA, because there's no way of controlling the USA's debt until China says it's had enough, and that's what we're kind of waiting for. But these national debts, in the past, they were diminished by inflation. They kind of grew and grew, but inflation ate away at them. And you could deal with quite a large amount of debt, particularly after the Second World War. We had much higher debts in general than we have now. It varies by country. But in this new era of very, very low inflation, the debts won't necessarily go away. And what the debt actually means is that you're paying often pretty well-off people for the privilege of having borrowed their money and sold them a government bond. And you could decide to do things in different ways. You could decide that you're not going to increase your debt as a country as much, but you're actually going to tax the land and the wealth of the well-off. You could do it differently. The danger for an individual country is that you're seen as a pariah. You're seen as odd or different if you behave in that way. But during the pandemic, all countries were able to dramatically increase their public spending because they didn't seem out of place, and they didn't become the country where the finance people said, oh, they're dangerous, pull the money out, crash their currency. And we're in that kind of a game again. And that matters for the UK, because we've just left the EU. We have our own little currency called sterling. It's, as long as we have a government that plays along in the same way that the global financiers like, we may be okay, but we may not even be okay with that. We don't know. We're kind of precarious. And all of that affects our ability to borrow money or our ability to tax instead of borrowing.
We have very little time left, and I want to talk about innovation and about climate change. So innovation, why do we have this idea or this feeling that actually there's a lot going on in terms of speed of innovation and new things, whereas you argue that no, actually not. But how about artificial intelligence, about how we share data and the speed of information? That is not innovation, in your opinion?
We currently have a kind of innovation in how much people talk about how much innovation we have. So there's, and you got to remember, I work at a university where, like all universities, we have a PR department who talk about how many new things we're inventing. At my university, yes, we invented a vaccine, but it's old technology. These vaccines are old technology, but it was good that we did it, but it wasn't a brand new thing. Whereas, of course, in the 1957 flu pandemic, when we first actually invented vaccines to deal with pandemics, that was innovation. And you can go back and you can measure things like the mobile phone or the telephone or telegrams, or even this, what we're doing now. I first got to do in the very early 1990s at Newcastle University, which is talking to people on little video screens like this. And that was exciting. But we're not talking to each other as some 3D holograms, right? We don't feel like we're in the same room. We're using a technology that's just 30 years old, where so far we've been lucky and the internet hasn't slowed down. But our worry is, it's not that fast.
Well, but about, I don't know, the integration of machines and humans. And so maybe we don't know, as you were saying in your presentation, maybe we just don't know. How about the metaverse? Maybe we will keep on buying stuff that we cannot see.
We can't be sure about the future, but what we can do is we can measure the rate of innovation, and we find it highest in the 1930s, and then less in the 40s, less in the 50s, because people were inventing things with electricity then for the first time that they could do. So we can actually measure it. Or you take something like, you're currently sitting in a room, and that room is probably quite comfortable. The temperature's just about right for you. Now, you could have a cleverer, it's okay, no, no, could be
It's
warmer.
a little cold, you know.
Okay.
Yeah, heating is very expensive nowadays in the UK, as you know.
It is expensive. But if you take an innovation with a heating system, we could get one that gets it within an exact half of a degree that works for you. But compared, and behind you is, I think, a fireplace, compared to the heating that our parents and grandparents had to live with, it was terrible. There are so many problems that we have largely solved that the innovation in the future isn't needed. And that's one of the reasons why the speed of innovation has slowed down.
To finish, to end this conversation, are you an optimist? Optimistic? Are you optimistic about the climate change and the agreements that countries might reach in Glasgow these days? Because at the end of the day, what you argue is that, well, population is eventually going to shrink, so we won't consume that much, and maybe this will get better.
I am optimistic because, and it's only been the last 20 years that we've realized that for very young girls, they could well be the first human beings alive to see the global population shrink because we decided to shrink for the first time in the history of our species, and that's quite incredible. I'm not particularly optimistic for COP26. It all appears to be stage managed to do that. But the thing that makes me optimistic about climate agreements in general occurring is my memory of nuclear agreements. I'm a teenager from the 70s and 80s. And it was Ronald Reagan, absolute idiot of an American president, but Ronald Reagan and the Russian counterparts who were drinking a lot, who actually signed the treaties and began to reduce our nuclear stockpiles, which have fallen now by around about 90%. So we're still at a great risk of a nuclear war. But the fact that that was possible, but it took 40 or 50 years from people like Einstein saying, you're all going to die if you carry on making these nuclear weapons, through to Reagan actually realizing, oh, this is true, we're not going to be able to survive a nuclear war. And we're impatient. We're really, really impatient as a species. And it's just good, but the impatience means that we don't spot the change in attitudes about the pollution or the realization that something as simple, carbon and temperature, the relationship is linear. It's nice, you double the carbon, you'll double the temperature increase. And it's nice and simple. People can understand it. It's not so complicated that you can't get it over in the same way as having a weapon that will annihilate millions and billions of people you can get through. So I'm optimistic about these things. My worry would be something where it was too hard to explain what was going on and we could never get it with our human brains. And that'll be the kind of thing that actually gets us in the end, rather than something we can do something about and we could actually improve our lives at the same time as doing it.
Professor Danny Dorling, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you ever so much for having me. Thank you.
Y a ustedes, por supuesto, también muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos y los invitamos a seguir disfrutando de todas las actividades del Festival Puerto de Ideas Valparaíso 2021 que se desarrollan, como ustedes saben, hasta el 14 de noviembre. Pueden seguir revisando la programación del festival y todo el contenido de Puerto Ideas en nuestra página web, puertoideas.cl. Muchas gracias. Hasta la próxima.
En Copeuch todos pueden ser socios. Y si a tu cooperativa le va bien, a ti también te va bien con tu remanente. Ya somos 1 millón de socios.